Okay, we are almost through with this chemistry stuff, and then we will start some real biology. My cousin Calvin is a good old boy from Magnolia, Arkansas. After college, Calvin went to work for Reynolds Tobacco Company. He made a bunch of money selling cancer sticks to elementary school kids. Well, maybe not. After 20 years or so, I think his conscience got the best of him, so he changed careers and went to work for a large candy company where he made bunches of money selling the greatest candy in the world to all us chocoholics. I suppose someday his conscience will get the best of him for contributing to the obesity of the U.S. population. But until then, I will keep eating the products he peddles. Now, when Uncle Calvin used to come and visit us driving his fully restored 1966 327 Corvette, full of samples of every kind of candy his company makes, and all the promotional stuff that goes along with selling it, our children nicknamed him the Candy Man. All right, so back to the hamburgers and fries we were talking about. We know that the cow gets fat from the corn and grass it eats, and I get fat from the cow I eat. And that is all because of the first law of thermodynamics. Have you ever heard anyone blame their weight on the first law of thermodynamics instead of Krispy Kreme? Well, energy has got to be transformed or stored. If we do not transform the energy, our bodies store it as lipids. In the case of mammals, those lipids are stored as fats. Plants store their energy in the form of carbohydrates, which we know now is the product of photosynthesis, the energy of the sun. 6CO2 plus 6H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6O2, formula for photosynthesis. But living systems do not use the energy from carbohydrates directly. The ultimate energy source is the breaking of chemical bonds in another compound called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. The corn transforms the sun's energy into the chemical energy of phosphate bonds. ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to ATP, adenosine triphosphate. In other words, the sun's energy provides the chemical bond energy to add a third phosphate group in the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis. Then, while we are all tucked in our beds at night sleeping, and in the secret recesses of the chloroplasts, plants convert chemical energy of ATP. ATP releases a phosphate and is converted back to ADP into the chemical bonds that form carbohydrates. In this case, glucose or fructose of what we know as simple sugars. This process, the forming of sugar, can occur without sunlight, not necessarily in the dark. This process is called the light-independent reaction, or the Calvin cycle. So now you know the rest of the story. Calvin, the candy man, sugar, okay? It's a little lame, but I bet you won't forget where sugar comes from in the formation of photosynthesis. The Calvin cycle is where sugar is produced in the dark. Okay, the cow transforms the carbohydrate and protein and fat, and we transform the cow into solid muscle and boundless energy. Okay, so just how does this happen? Let's look at the equation for photosynthesis backwards. C6H12O6 plus 6CO2 yields 6CO2 plus 6H2O. In other words, sugar plus oxygen yields carbon dioxide plus water. We eat the sugar, we breathe in the oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide, and we go to the bathroom. Okay, these two equations are basically just the opposite of each other. They are the oxidation-reduction reactions that support all, or at least most, living systems on Earth. Plants separate the oxygen from the hydrogen of water and use the electrons and the hydrogen ions to make ATP. And then we use the carbon dioxide to form the carbohydrates and the glucose. Then animals come along and break the bonds of the carbohydrates and attach the oxygen we breathe to the carbon to reform carbon dioxide. I know it sounds very difficult, and the actual chemistry is extremely complex. But after all is said and done, it is a simple process of chemical bonds, electrons being moved from one atom or molecule to another. Along the way, some of the energy, in the form of electrons, is released back into the atmosphere as heat. Electrons jumping from atom to atom. This represents the second law of thermodynamics. As I said in the previous lecture, this ability to transform energy is one of the defining characteristics of living systems. And ultimately, all this energy comes from sunlight. As we will see later in this class, some of the earliest life forms did not use sunlight, but rather the chemical energy of hydrogen bonds in sulfur and other gases released from volcanic action under the ocean. These organisms still exist, and scientists discovered in the 1970s them deep in the oceans. These anaerobic bacteria support a thriving food web at the very depths of the ocean. Cellular respiration is just the opposite of photosynthesis, using oxygen to reform the bonds in the deep oceans that lack sunlight. The bacteria use chemical energy stored in the bonds of hydrogen and sulfur rather than radiant energy of the sunlight. And of course, yeast does a version of cellular respiration without oxygen. We call this fermentation, and the infamous process of producing ethyl alcohol in beer and wine. However, without oxygen, the process stops and produces only 4 net ATP, so not very much energy is formed. That is why beer and wine are so fattening. The energy is still there. It's in the alcohol. When we drink the alcohol, we convert it to the carbohydrates, to the fats that stay with our bodies so long. So cellular respiration can occur, but without oxygen, it is not as efficient in forming ATP. That is why there are 3 steps in cellular respiration. Glycolysis, no oxygen, is the first step. The Kreb cycle and electron transport with oxygen are the second step, and the third step in cellular respiration. Only 2 steps in photosynthesis, the light-dependent reaction, which we call electron transport, and the light-independent reaction, or Uncle Kelvin's, the Kelvin cycle, which produces the carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration can take place without oxygen, but photosynthesis cannot take place without carbon dioxide. Okay, one last thought. Why do we have lungs, and why do we call our lungs part of the respiratory system? Because we need the oxygen for cellular respiration, and we need to get rid of the carbon dioxide, which is a waste product. Much of the evolutionary development of living organisms is based on this ability to exchange gases, another characteristic of all living things. As we see, this is one of the things that limits the size of cells, and therefore the size of organisms. We need to figure out a way to get oxygen and carbon dioxide to cells without creating very complex systems for doing that. This way of doing that has defined the variety or the diversity that we see in all living organisms. From the smallest to the largest, each organism has had to deal with this problem of gas exchange. That includes us. Well, I guess it's time to go out and exchange some gases, do a little aerobic exercise. See you next time. Thank you.